By the late 1940s, China was no longer merely unstable. It was tearing itself apart under the weight of a civil war that would permanently reshape the global balance of power. What had begun decades earlier as a struggle between competing visions of China had reached its final and most decisive phase. The ruling government, the Republic of China, was collapsing. Despite having international recognition and having fought on the Allied side during World War II, it was losing control of the mainland at an accelerating pace. Corruption, exhaustion from years of war, economic breakdown, and a growing loss of public trust hollowed out its authority. In contrast, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had evolved into a highly organized revolutionary force. It was no longer a scattered guerrilla movement. It was a disciplined army with political cohesion, popular mobilization, and crucial external support from the Soviet Union. As communist forces advanced across the mainland, city after city fell. The nationalist leadership faced a stark reality. Remaining on the mainland meant annihilation. In one of the largest political evacuations of the 20th century, government officials, soldiers, bureaucrats, intellectuals, and over 1 million loyal civilians fled across the Taiwan Strait by boat and aircraft. Their destination was Taiwan, an island that had only recently emerged from 50 years of Japanese colonial rule after Japan's defeat in World War II. This retreat did not mark the end of the Chinese Civil War. Instead, it froze it. On the mainland, Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The declaration was not merely administrative, it was ideological. Mao framed his new state as the restoration of China after a century of humiliation, promising national revival, unity, and independence from foreign domination. The Soviet Union recognized the new communist government almost immediately, reinforcing its legitimacy and embedding China within the socialist bloc. But the war's conclusion remained incomplete. Across the strait, the Republic of China refused to dissolve. From Taiwan, it continued to claim that it was the rightful government of all China, insisting that its presence on the island was temporary. Both governments claimed sovereignty over the same nation. Both rejected the legitimacy of the other. The conflict had not ended. It had merely shifted geography. For Mao, Taiwan was unfinished business. The communist victory was incomplete as long as the island remained outside Beijing's control. But the reality of military capability imposed a pause. In the late 1940s, the People's Republic of China lacked a navy and air force capable of crossing the Taiwan Strait. Without maritime dominance, an invasion was impossible. Taiwan, for the moment, was beyond reach. Inside Taiwan, the nationalist government transformed the island into a heavily militarized stronghold. Martial law was imposed. Political opposition was crushed. Anyone suspected of communist sympathy, disloyalty, or even advocating a separate Taiwanese identity faced imprisonment or execution. The government's priority was survival, preserving its claim to China and preventing infiltration or rebellion. Taiwan became a state ruled by fear, discipline, and constant preparation for a future counteroffensive that would likely never come. Meanwhile, Mao consolidated power on the mainland. He reorganized China's political system, reshaped society, and began building the military capabilities necessary to eventually reclaim Taiwan. The island was never forgotten. It was simply postponed. At first, the United States hesitated to intervene. Washington had just emerged from World War II exhausted and overstretched. Its strategic focus shifted toward Europe, where rebuilding shattered economies and containing Soviet influence became the primary objective. Although American leaders disliked the emergence of a communist China, they were reluctant to plunge into another Asian conflict. Taiwan and Korea were viewed as peripheral concerns. This hesitation was made explicit when American officials articulated a defensive perimeter in Asia, a line that defined where the United States would and would not commit military force. Taiwan was outside that line. To many in Washington, this signaled restraint. To others, it looked like surrender. Then, in 1950, everything changed. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. Armed and equipped by the Soviet Union, And approved by both Moscow and Beijing, the invasion nearly collapsed the South within weeks. To American policymakers, this no longer looked like isolated regional unrest. It appeared coordinated, a communist offensive aimed at reshaping Asia. The United States reversed its policy overnight. It intervened militarily in Korea, and at the same time made a decision that would define the Taiwan question for generations. It sent naval forces to the Taiwan Strait to block any communist invasion. This move transformed Taiwan from a leftover of a civil war into a central pillar of Cold War strategy. To justify the sudden shift, Washington leaned on legal ambiguity. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony until 1945, and although the Allies had agreed that it would be returned to China, the island's final legal status had not yet been formalized through comprehensive treaties. This allowed the United States to argue that Taiwan's sovereignty was technically undetermined, creating space for American military involvement without formally recognizing Taiwanese independence or Chinese sovereignty. From Beijing's perspective, this was a betrayal. Taiwan, they argued, was unquestionably Chinese territory. The United States had intervened not as a neutral stabilizer, but as an occupying power blocking national reunification. Mao now faced a transformed reality. By approving North Korea's invasion, he had unintentionally brought American military power directly to China's doorstep. Taiwan was no longer just an island across a narrow strait. It was now protected by the world's most powerful navy. The Korean War dragged on for 3 brutal years, ending in a stalemate rather than victory. But its consequences extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. The United States committed itself to Asia long-term, constructing a network of military bases and alliances designed to contain communism. Taiwan sat near the center of this defensive chain, making it strategically indispensable. Congress authorized the U.S. president to defend Taiwan. Nuclear weapons were deployed in the region. Military planners openly considered the possibility of nuclear strikes against China should war erupt. Deterrence became the guiding principle, not peace through agreement, but peace through the threat of catastrophic retaliation. Mao tested these boundaries. Chinese forces shelled islands controlled by the Republic of China near the mainland, probing American resolve and mobilizing nationalist sentiment at home. The United States responded with overwhelming force. Aircraft carriers, advanced aircraft, missile systems, and the implicit threat of nuclear escalation. The world came dangerously close to another global war. The immediate crisis passed, but the conflict did not resolve. Instead, it settled into a strange equilibrium: limited shelling, symbolic strikes, calculated restraint. Across the Taiwan Strait, neither side wanted to trigger a full-scale war, but neither was willing to concede. By the mid-1950s, Taiwan was no longer just a Chinese issue. It had become a fault line in the global Cold War, a place where ideology, military power, legal ambiguity, and national pride intersected. And that tension was only beginning. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Taiwan question was no longer a regional dispute frozen in time. It had become embedded in the deepest structures of the Cold War itself. Nuclear weapons now shaped decision-making on all sides, and Taiwan sat at the intersection of ideology, deterrence, and unresolved history. The United States expanded its military footprint across East Asia, constructing what became known as an island chain, a defensive arc stretching from Japan through Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines. This chain was designed to contain communist expansion and limit China's access to the Pacific Ocean. Taiwan was no longer just protected, it was strategically indispensable. American policymakers authorized extreme measures to preserve that position, including the deployment of nuclear weapons in the region and contingency plans that openly contemplated nuclear strikes on mainland China if war broke out. For Beijing, this reality was humiliating and dangerous. Taiwan, a territory the Communist Party regarded as unfinished business of the Civil War, had been transformed into a forward base of American power less than 150 kilometers from the Chinese coast. Mao responded not with surrender, but with pressure. Chinese artillery barrages on nearby islands controlled by the Republic of China were not intended to win territory. They were tests. Tests of American resolve. Tests of escalation limits. tests of how far deterrence could be pushed without triggering catastrophe. At moments, those test tests nearly failed. American military planners seriously debated nuclear use. Soviet leaders watched nervously, warning Washington that an attack on China could trigger a larger war. The world entered an era where Taiwan's fate was inseparable from the possibility of nuclear annihilation. Yet history took another turn. In the 1960s, the communist world fractured. The People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, once portrayed as ideological brothers, began to drift apart, then openly clash. Their split was rooted in deep disagreements: ideology, leadership, strategy, and national ambition. Mao viewed Soviet leaders as cautious and compromised, too willing to coexist with the capitalist West. Soviet leaders viewed Mao as reckless, destabilizing, and dangerously unpredictable, especially as China lurched through disastrous internal campaigns that caused mass famine and suffering. The rift escalated into border clashes and threats of military strikes. At one point, the Soviets even considered attacking Chinese nuclear facilities they had helped build. China now faced a new reality. Its greatest threat might no longer be the United States, but its former ally. This fracture created a historic opening. In Washington, strategists recognized that the Cold War no longer had to be a simple two-sided struggle. If the United States could exploit the Sino-Soviet split, it could rebalance global power. Under President Richard Nixon, American policy toward China began to change, quietly at first, then dramatically. Secret diplomatic channels opened. Communication was indirect, cautious, and highly sensitive. When American envoys finally reached Beijing, the conversation quickly converged on a single issue: Taiwan. Chinese leaders were unequivocal. Taiwan was not a side topic or a negotiable footnote. It was the core of China's sovereignty claim. They rejected the American idea that Taiwan's status was undetermined. From Beijing's perspective, the island had been promised back to China after World War II, and only U.S. intervention had prevented reunification. Privately, American officials acknowledged uncomfortable truths. They conceded that without the Korean War, U.S. policy toward Taiwan might have evolved very differently. They admitted that history, not principle, had frozen the situation. What mattered now was strategy. The United States wanted leverage against the Soviet Union and a way out of Vietnam. China wanted removal of American troops and nuclear weapons from Taiwan and recognition of the One China principle. Taiwan itself was not present at the table. This was the moment when Taiwan's vulnerability became unmistakable. Its security, once guaranteed by treaty, was now shaped by calculations far beyond its control. In the early 1970s, the shift became public. The People's Republic of China took China's seat at the United Nations. Taiwan was expelled. President Nixon traveled to Beijing, signaling a thaw that stunned the world. Over the following years, the United States withdrew nuclear weapons from Taiwan, reduced its military presence, and prepared for full diplomatic normalization with Beijing. In 1979, the transformation was finalized. The United States officially recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China and severed formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Embassies moved. Treaties ended. Taiwan became a diplomatic orphan almost overnight. But the story did not end there. Inside the United States, many lawmakers believed abandoning Taiwan entirely would damage American credibility and betray a population that had aligned itself with U.S. interests for decades. Congress responded by passing the Taiwan Relations Act, a deliberately ambiguous law that defined U.S. policy for the next half-century. The law did three critical things. First, it maintained unofficial relations with Taiwan despite the lack of formal recognition. Second, it mandated U.S. arms sales to Taiwan so the island could defend itself. Third, it stated that the United States would maintain the capability to resist force used against Taiwan without explicitly promising military intervention. This ambiguity was intentional. It reassured Taiwan without encouraging independence, and it deterred China without issuing guarantees that could trigger war. Strategic ambiguity became the cornerstone of stability. China viewed the law as a betrayal of spirit, if not letter. evidence that the United States was not fully sincere even as relations improved. But Beijing chose patience over confrontation, believing time and economic integration could eventually solve the problem. Meanwhile, Taiwan itself began to change. After decades of authoritarian rule, Taiwan underwent a dramatic internal transformation. Martial law ended. Political opposition emerged. Elections became competitive. By the 1990s, Taiwan had transitioned into a full democracy, one of the most open and prosperous societies in Asia. This shift fundamentally altered the Taiwan question. The island was no longer just a remnant government claiming all of China. It was a self-governing democracy with a distinct identity. Fewer and fewer people saw themselves as Chinese nationals waiting to return to the mainland. More saw themselves as Taiwanese. Beijing reacted with alarm. Democracy threatened not only political separation, but ideological contrast. When the United States signaled support for Taiwan's democratic process, China responded with military intimidation, missile tests, troop deployments, and naval exercises designed to warn the island against moving too close to Washington. The crisis peaked in 1996, when China fired missiles near Taiwan ahead of its first direct presidential election. The United States responded by deploying aircraft carrier groups to the region, the largest show of force since Vietnam. The election went ahead. Taiwan's democracy survived. Chinese coercion had failed. By this point, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The strategic logic that once united Washington and Beijing had weakened. Taiwan once again moved to the center of rising tension. Yet Taiwan had learned a crucial lesson. Security depended on relevance. The island invested heavily in high-value industries, particularly advanced semiconductor manufacturing. Over time, Taiwan became indispensable to the global economy. The most advanced microchips, critical to consumer electronics, artificial intelligence, and modern weapons systems, were increasingly manufactured almost exclusively on the island. This created a new layer of deterrence. Taiwan was no longer protected only by ambiguity and arms sales, but by its centrality to global supply chains. Any conflict over Taiwan would ripple across the world economy. China did not abandon its goal. In 2005, Beijing passed the Anti-Secession Law, declaring that peaceful reunification remained the goal, but force would be used if Taiwan moved toward formal independence or if reunification became impossible. The United States rejected coercion, insisting that Taiwan's future must be decided peacefully. Under Xi Jinping, the Taiwan question has intensified once more. Xi frames reunification as a core component of national rejuvenation. China's military has expanded rapidly, developing capabilities explicitly designed for operations against Taiwan. Missile forces, naval power, cyber warfare, and blockade scenarios. Taiwan, meanwhile, remains trapped in its long-standing paradox: de facto independence without de jure recognition, democratic legitimacy without sovereign certainty. Most of its population rejects reunification, yet formal independence risks war. The United States continues to rely on strategic ambiguity, refusing to say clearly whether it would fight for Taiwan while acting in ways that suggest it might. This uncertainty deters both sides, but it also ensures that the situation remains fragile. 75 years after the Chinese Civil War froze across the Taiwan Strait, its unresolved legacy still shapes global politics. Taiwan is not merely an island. It is a test case for how power, deterrence, history, and identity collide, and whether ambiguity can continue to prevent a conflict that no side can afford, yet no side is willing to resolve outright.